Before we begin, let me grab your attention, because what you're about to hear will shock you, move you, and remind you why humanity still matters. Imagine a millionaire laughing in the face of a homeless single father, only for a truth so unexpected to unfold that it silences an entire bank. This story will change how you see people forever. Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Stories of Kindness for more life-changing tales. Elias had learned long ago that life could collapse silently, the way a house falls to ash under a fire that starts with a single spark. And as he walked through the cold morning air with his daughter's tiny fingers wrapped around his own, he carried that memory like a wound that never healed, a reminder of the moment everything shifted. The city around him was awake with its usual indifference, bus horns echoing between tall buildings, street vendors heating their grills, commuters tapping impatiently at crosswalk buttons. But he felt detached from it all, moving through a world that looked familiar yet kept him at a distance, reminding him that he no longer belonged to the rhythm of the people who lived in apartments, held jobs, or had reliable warmth waiting at home. His jacket, brown once, now a tired mix of faded fabric and frayed stitches, hung loosely from his shoulders, barely shielding him from the biting wind. It had seen rainstorms, bitter nights, and mornings where he'd forced himself to smile for his daughter's sake. Every thread felt like a testimony of survival. Lila, only 6 yet far older in spirit than a child should be, hopped beside him with a soft skip in her step, clutching a little plush cat whose fur had thinned from years of comfort. She looked up at him with bright, trusting eyes that believed that as long as she held her father's hand, nothing bad could truly win. And that belief, fragile and powerful, was the very thing that kept him moving. They had spent the night behind the old Stanton Street bookstore again, the one that had closed long before Lila was born. Its arched entryway provided shelter from the rain, and while the concrete was unforgiving and the nights loud with clattering bottles and distant echoes, it was the closest thing they had to a home. Elias always tucked Lila inside their single thin blanket, placing his body between her and the wind. Many nights, she would wake from nightmares, whispering for her mother, and Elias would hold her through the shivering, telling her stories of the woman she barely remembered, a woman with laughter like warm rain, and a heart that softened every space she entered. Losing her had broken him, shattered him beyond recognition, but he never let Lila see the deepest cracks. She had already lost too much. This morning, however, carried a strange energy, something between fear and hope, because tucked into his jacket pocket was a letter, creased, slightly damp, but more terrifying than any cold night. It came from a charity outreach program that visited the shelter twice a month. The letter claimed that an anonymous sponsor had made a contribution in his name and requested he visit Brookline Bank to verify his account details. That single line, "Verify your account," haunted him. He hadn't had a bank account in years, not since the fire that destroyed everything he owned, his carpentry shop, the tools he'd spent a lifetime collecting, his savings, and worst of all, his wife, who had been closing the shop early that day when faulty wiring sparked a blaze he couldn't reach in time. He rarely spoke of the fire, barely allowed himself to remember, but its ghost lived in every fear he carried. Every night he lay awake listening to the distant crackle of passing cars and imagining flames he could never outrun. The idea that someone, anyone, might have thought of him enough to deliver such a letter felt unreal. People usually walked past him like he was part of the sidewalk. They stared at the ground, their phones, the sky, anything but his face. The world had a way of acting blind to suffering it didn't want to see. But this letter, it was a whisper of possibility, a suggestion that maybe fate wasn't entirely finished with him. Still, as he approached the bank with its polished windows and tall revolving doors, anxiety tightened around his ribs like a vice. He felt out of place immediately, his boots worn, his hair untrimmed, his hands rough and calloused. Lila pressed her cheek against his arm, looking around with curiosity rather than shame. "Daddy, are we going to get money today?" she asked in her small, hopeful voice. Elias forced a gentle smile. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe they just need to check something." But even saying the words, his stomach twisted. What if it was a mistake? What if the letter wasn't really meant for him? What if walking into that gleaming bank led to humiliation instead of help? He could already imagine the stares, the whispers, the discomfort strangers felt when someone like him dared to enter a place reserved for the respectable. He knew the look, the one that said, "Why are you here?" But he also knew that every parent, no matter how hopeless the situation, had an obligation to try, to show their child that surviving meant pushing forward even when fear screamed otherwise. He paused just outside the bank door, letting the morning sun warm the side of his face. He looked down at Lila. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "you stay close to me, okay?" She nodded, her small hand squeezing his. Always. Those 4 letters were enough. Together they stepped into the large, echoing lobby. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh paper. Customers in neatly pressed clothes stood in lines while employees in crisp uniforms typed quickly behind their desks. A security guard gave Elias a long, assessing glance, but Lila's presence softened the scrutiny, and the guard looked away. A few customers eyed him curiously, some with pity, others with silent judgment, but he kept his head low and walked toward the reception desk. The young clerk behind the counter smiled politely, though Elias could see her surprise flicker for a moment. He cleared his throat, wishing his voice didn't tremble. "Hi. I was told to come here. I received this." He carefully unfolded the letter, smoothing its edges as though afraid it might crumble. The clerk read it quickly, then nodded with professional efficiency. "Of course, sir. May I have your ID?" He handed her the only identification he possessed, an old card slightly bent at the corners. She typed his name into the system. Lila peeked over the counter, watching the screen as if deciphering its glowing symbols. A man walking past wrinkled his nose as though the presence of a homeless father and child disrupted the lobby's carefully maintained order. One woman stepped aside as if he carried an invisible stain. Elias felt the weight of their judgments, the same blade he'd endured countless times, but he kept his gaze on Lila's swinging feet and reminded himself why he was there. Above the lobby, unseen by him, sat a man in a corner office. A man whose life was paved with wealth, arrogance, and the absence of empathy. Miles Rockford, a millionaire who spent mornings reviewing financial reports from behind tinted glass, noticed Elias immediately. He nudged his assistant and laughed, short, sharp, mocking, the kind of laugh that stings even when you don't know its source. Elias heard it echo off the marble walls, but he didn't realize it was directed at him. His shoulders tensed anyway. Yet despite the judgment and the fear, he stayed, because hope, no matter how fragile, still flickered within him like a small flame refusing to die. And as the clerk typed, paused, frowned slightly, then typed again, something began shifting. Something none of the polished bankers, passing customers, or even the sneering millionaire could anticipate. A truth lay hidden in the system, waiting to reveal itself, waiting to turn humiliation into something far more shocking. "Sir," the clerk said, her voice suddenly softer. "Please wait just a moment." She rose from her seat and hurried toward a manager's office. Elias felt his breath hitch. Lila tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, is something wrong?" He didn't know, but he was about to, and what he was about to learn would change everything. Miles Rockford had always believed that life rewarded the strong, the clever, the relentless. People like him, who carved their way to the top with sharp elbows and sharper instincts. So when he stood in his glass-walled private lounge overlooking the Brookline Bank lobby, sipping imported espresso and reviewing projections for his upcoming acquisition, he felt every bit the king surveying his kingdom, confident that the world beneath him moved exactly as he expected it to. He wore a charcoal suit that looked like it had been tailored directly onto his body, his silver hair slicked back with precision, his jaw cleanly shaven. Everything about him was polished, rehearsed, controlled. In that controlled world, he had grown accustomed to identifying people with a single glance, who belonged, who didn't, who had value, and who clung to the edges of society like shadows. That morning when his eyes drifted lazily toward the lobby and landed on a man with a frayed jacket, worn boots, and a little girl clutching his hand, Miles felt an instinctive curl of judgment inside him, a habitual disdain he had never bothered questioning. To him, Elias looked like a man who had failed at life. Not because Miles knew his story, but because he assumed there was no story worth knowing. His assistant, Pamela, followed his gaze, adjusting her sleek glasses as she clicked her pen against a tablet filled with contracts. "There's always one," she muttered, in a tone that suggested inconvenience rather than cruelty. Miles smirked. "Coming in here like we're a charity donation bin," he said, swirling the espresso cup between his fingers. "Why do people embarrass themselves like this?" Pamela shrugged. "Maybe he's hoping for a loan." Miles's chuckle was cold. "If he can't afford a haircut, he can't afford interest." He said it casually, almost lazily, unaware of how sharply the words would echo someday in his memory. Miles enjoyed observing people who didn't fit. He thought it reminded him of how far he'd risen above them. But what he didn't realize was that he wasn't looking down from a place of strength, but from a place of blindness. He watched Elias approach the reception desk with noticeable hesitation, watched him pull out a letter with shaking hands, watched his daughter peek curiously over the counter. Something about the child's innocence, the way she swung her plush cat gently as she stood on tiptoe, momentarily tugged at Miles's attention, but he brushed away the feeling like a bothersome fly. Empathy had no value in his worldview. Too costly, too distracting. Besides, he had built his empire by ensuring emotion never clouded strategy. His father had taught him that. An iron-willed businessman who believed kindness was a liability. "Never give a piece of the world you earn to someone who hasn't earned theirs," his father used to say. Miles followed that doctrine religiously. As Miles leaned closer to the glass, the faint sound of Elias's voice reached him, not the words, just the tremble within them. It made Miles sneer. "Listen to him," he said to Pamela. "Begging already, I bet." Pamela simply nodded, accustomed to his commentary. They had once witnessed a man in worn clothes come in asking for a statement for a closed account. Miles laughed then too. He always laughed at them, the people who reminded him of vulnerability, the one enemy he could never accept. Vulnerability meant chaos. It meant lack of control. It meant the kind of danger he avoided at all costs. Down in the lobby, however, something Miles couldn't see was unfolding. The clerk had paused after, typing Elias's information. Paused long enough for curiosity to prick Miles' instincts. He leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. "What's taking so long?" he muttered. Pamela peered over her tablet. "Probably trying to make excuses for him," she said. But Miles wasn't fully convinced. He watched the clerk disappear into the manager's office with the letter in hand. That was unusual, annoying, out of pattern. He disliked things that didn't align with his expectations. His world was meant to obey a set of predictable rules. He had built his success on those rules. People like Elias didn't disrupt banks. They didn't cause managers to stand from their seats. They didn't make clerks widen their eyes or glance nervously at screens. Yet that was exactly what was happening. Miles cleared his throat, irritation creeping into his posture. "What is this?" he murmured. Pamela shrugged again, but subtly. Miles didn't like uncertainty, especially not when he was preparing for a major acquisition that required absolute focus. He prided himself on reading situations quickly, spotting anomalies before others did. And this, whatever was happening, was an anomaly. "I'll go take a look," he said, setting down his cup with a decisive clack. Pamela blinked, surprised. Miles rarely left his glass fortress unless speaking to high-value clients or executives. But his curiosity, sharpened by ego, demanded answers. As he descended the staircase to the lobby, each step echoed with a blend of authority and impatience. People parted slightly as he walked. Partly because of his reputation, partly because of the way he carried himself, like a man accustomed to moving through spaces that rearranged themselves in his favor. Elias, unaware of who Miles was, or of the disdain he carried, remained focused on the manager who had just emerged from the back office, holding the letter carefully as though it were something delicate, something important. Miles stopped a few feet away, pretending to examine a brochure rack while positioning himself close enough to hear. The manager cleared his throat politely. "Mr. Elias," he said, "could you please follow me? We need to verify a few things." His tone was respectful, too respectful in Miles's opinion, for a man dressed in threadbare clothing. Elias nodded nervously, lifting Lila into his arms as she rested her head against his shoulder. Miles felt something shift again, an unfamiliar flicker of discomfort watching the child cling to her father. It reminded him of memories he'd buried so deeply he barely recognized them. Memories of a small boy, him, reaching for a father who was always too busy, too stern, too unforgiving. He shook the thought away. Elias disappeared into the manager's office, the door clicking shut behind him. Miles's jaw clenched. Something significant was happening, and he wasn't part of it. He hated that. He approached the receptionist casually, leaning on the counter with the authority of a man used to answers. "What was that about?" he asked. The clerk hesitated, clearly aware of who he was but equally aware of confidentiality rules. "Just verifying some information, Mr. Rockford," she said. Her smile was nervous. That only fueled his curiosity. He paced the lobby for several minutes, pretending to review emails on his phone while keeping an ear tuned to the muffled conversation behind the office door. Every second stretched annoyingly, and with each passing moment, the irritation inside him grew. The world felt briefly off balance, like a chessboard where a pawn moved in a way no pawn should. Finally, unable to restrain himself, he positioned closer just as the door reopened and the representative from the outreach charity stepped in. Another anomaly. She was holding a folder and breathing hard as though she had rushed to arrive. Miles froze mid-step. Why was a charity representative here for that man? Why did the staff suddenly move with urgency? Why was the atmosphere shifting from routine to something else entirely? A knot formed in his stomach, foreign, uncomfortable, unwelcome. For the first time in years, Miles felt something he didn't recognize. The manager motioned for Elias to take a seat inside the small glass-walled office, the kind of room used for private financial discussions, spaces where people finalized mortgages, opened investment portfolios, or quietly negotiated debts. Yet for Elias, sitting there felt like intruding on a world he had long been exiled from, a world polished and quiet where every surface gleamed and every sound was hushed with professional courtesy. He gently placed Lila on the cushioned chair beside him, her little legs swinging freely as her plush cat rested on her lap. The representative from the outreach charity entered moments later, clutching a thick folder, her cheeks flushed from rushing. The manager gave her a respectful nod, then sat behind the desk and opened Elias's account on his monitor, though he lowered the screen slightly, as if unsure whether showing the details outright might overwhelm the man sitting across from him. Elias's heart thudded heavily in his chest. He kept wiping his palms on his knees, feeling like sweat had coated his hands despite the chilly air conditioning. He had walked into the bank expecting nothing, perhaps a small formality, maybe a confirmation that a minor donation had been placed for him, perhaps a few thousand rupees from someone kind enough to notice his situation. Even that would have felt like a blessing. But the atmosphere in the room told him that whatever this was, it was not small. The air felt charged, the way the sky feels before lightning strikes. The manager cleared his throat, glancing at the charity representative. She nodded for him to continue. "Mr. Elias," he began slowly, his voice steady but unusually gentle. "When you came in, our system located an account registered under your name. At first I assumed it might be inactive, but—" His pause stretched, making Elias's stomach twist. "The account is active. Very active." Elias blinked. "Active, but I don't—" He couldn't complete the sentence. The manager clicked a few keys, verifying the information for the third time. Then he turned the monitor slightly, not fully toward Elias, but enough for him to see a string of numbers that didn't look real. For a moment, Elias didn't process it. The digits swam, blending, refusing to make sense. Then his breath hitched. There, clearly displayed, was a balance so large he felt dizzy merely looking at it. 93 million rupees. 93 million Mauritian rupees. His mind stuttered. No, that must be wrong, he whispered, instinctively pulling back as though the screen might burn him. There's no way. Sir, I'm homeless. His voice cracked like something inside him was breaking open. Lila looked from the screen to her father, trying to understand. Daddy, is that a lot? She asked, tilting her head. Elias swallowed hard. Yes, sweetheart, he said faintly. It's more than I've ever had. More than I've ever seen. The charity representative leaned forward, her eyes warm with empathy. Mr. Elias, the deposit was made early this morning by an anonymous corporate donor. We were notified moments after the transfer was processed. A small tremble ran through Elias's shoulders. But why? Why me? Who would? His voice faded as emotion clogged his throat. For so long, every coin he collected, every scrap of food he saved, every night he protected his daughter, all of it had been done in a world that felt like it had forgotten him completely. Now that same world felt as though it had spun on its axis and pointed a beam of impossible light directly at him. He didn't know how to breathe under that brightness. Outside the office, the bank lobby had grown unusually still. Customers, tellers, even the security guards seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening behind the glass walls. They couldn't see the monitor clearly, but they could see. Reactions, the widening eyes, the stunned silence, the faint tremble of the manager's hand as he verified figures again and again. And in the far corner, standing near a brochure rack he pretended to read, Miles Rockford watched everything unfold with a tightening jaw and a flicker of something deeply unsettling in his expression. He couldn't hear the details, but he saw the stunned shock on the manager's face and the overwhelmed disbelief in Elias's posture. That alone made Miles shift uncomfortably. People like Elias weren't supposed to cause ripples in banks. They weren't supposed to sit in private offices with managers and charity representatives. They certainly weren't supposed to see numbers on screens that looked like winning lottery amounts. Back inside the office, the manager spoke again. Mr. Elias, this kind of transfer doesn't happen by mistake. It went through every verification protocol. It's legitimate. Elias put both hands over his face as tears began slipping through his fingers, not loud or dramatic tears, but quiet, stunned tears of a man who had been drowning for years and just now felt something resembling solid ground beneath him. His shoulders shook silently. Lila, seeing her father cry in a way she had never seen before, slid off her chair and wrapped her tiny arms around him. "Daddy, are you hurt?" she whispered, voice trembling. He pulled her into his chest. "No, sweetheart, I'm not hurt. I just don't understand." The charity representative gently opened the folder she had brought. Inside were documents, notes written in neat cursive, witness accounts, medical reports, and a few photographs. She placed one on the desk. "Mr. Elias," she said softly, "do you remember an elderly man who collapsed near the riverside construction site 2 months ago?" Elias lifted his head slightly, eyes red. "The man who fainted?" "Yes." "I called an ambulance. I stayed with him." The representative nodded. "You didn't leave his side for over half an hour." "Performed basic CPR until paramedics arrived. You held his hand when he regained consciousness. Do you remember?" Elias nodded slowly, confused by where the conversation was heading. He was scared," Elias murmured. "I couldn't leave him." The representative slid another paper forward. "That man's name is Thomas Wainwright." The name meant nothing to Elias, but the manager's eyebrows rose slightly. Miles, still outside, caught the faint movement and frowned deeper. Mr. Wainwright is a private, immensely wealthy philanthropist, the representative continued. He avoids the public eye, but he is very aware of the world around him. After he recovered, he asked our organization to identify the man who saved him. She smiled gently. That man was you. Elias stared, unmoving. It felt surreal, like she was talking about a stranger. He donated all of that? For me? His whisper was barely audible. For you and your daughter, she corrected. He said, and I quote, "A man who saves a life with empty pockets and a full heart deserves more than the world has given him." Her voice softened. He asked that you not be notified until the transfer was complete. He wanted no credit, only for you to have a chance. Elias broke again, not with despair this time, but with overwhelming gratitude, disbelief, and relief so powerful his entire body trembled. He wept openly, clutching Lila to him as she stroked his cheek with her tiny hand, confused but trying to comfort him. The manager politely handed him tissues, his own eyes moistening. Even the charity representative blinked back tears. Outside the office door, the bank lobby had gone silent. Workers had stopped typing, conversations had halted mid-sentence, and Miles Rockford stood frozen, watching the man he had mocked minutes earlier, experiencing a moment so profound, so extraordinary, that even his cynical heart felt a tremor. Something heavy and uncomfortable, shame perhaps, settled into his chest. He had laughed. He had sneered. He had judged without knowing, and now, without warning, truth had risen like a tidal wave, crashing into the walls of his arrogance. Inside the office, as Elias wiped his tears and the reality of the moment sank in, he whispered words that carried the weight of years. I don't know how to deserve this, but I will not waste it. And the bank, normally a place of numbers and transactions, held its breath, because it had just witnessed a miracle measured not in currency, but in humanity. The next morning arrived with an unusual stillness, the kind that made Thomas wake before the sun even brushed against the city buildings. He sat up slowly on the small guest bed Julian had insisted he use, blankets soft around him, too soft almost, reminding him again that this wasn't his life, not his world. He wasn't used to pillows that didn't feel like thin sheets of air, or rooms that didn't echo with cold drafts. For a moment he simply sat there, staring at his hands, wondering if this was all temporary kindness or the beginning of something that could finally pull him out of the spiral he'd been living in. And then, almost as if summoned by his thoughts, Emily appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes and yawning in the most adorably theatrical way, as she shuffled in with her blanket trailing behind her. "Daddy," she murmured, voice groggy. "Is it morning?" "It is, sweetheart," Thomas whispered, pulling her into his arms. She snuggled into his chest as though she'd been waiting her whole life for this specific moment of warmth, safety, and peace. And maybe, Thomas thought, she had. The last few months had been brutal, not only on him but on her. His innocent little girl who never complained, never asked why they slept in shelters, why their dinner sometimes came from a donation box, why she wore the same sweater again and again. He kissed the top of her head, silently promising that if this opportunity with Julian was real, he would never let them go back to the edge of survival again. By the time the two of them entered the kitchen, the smell of toasted bread and something sweet filled the air. Julian stood by the counter wearing an apron that said "World's Okayest Chef," flipping pancakes with the kind of intense concentration people usually reserved for surgery. When the pancake landed perfectly on the plate, he raised his hands triumphantly. "Yes, witness my greatness," Emily giggled. "That's silly." Julian turned around, spotted her, and instantly softened. "Ah, my favorite critic. Come taste test the masterpiece." Emily scampered over to the table, climbing into a chair with eager anticipation. Thomas, meanwhile, lingered near the doorway, still unsure how much space he was allowed to take. Julian noticed. "Relax," he said with a small laugh. "It's just breakfast, not a contract negotiation." Thomas tried to smile, but seeing this kind of care, this kind of normal, warm morning, almost made him feel unbalanced. I'm not used to all of this, he admitted quietly. Julian placed a plate in front of him. Then get used to it, at least for now, because you and Emily are staying here until things get sorted. Thomas blinked. Julian, I can't. You can, Julian interrupted firmly. And you will. No arguments. There was something almost brotherly in the command, something Thomas wasn't sure how to process. But before he could dwell on it, Emily took a giant bite of pancake and gasped dramatically. It's yummy! Julian placed his hands on his hips. Aha, you see? A professional review. Breakfast became a surprisingly warm moment of family-like chaos. Emily talking in circles about dreams she barely remembered. Julian pretending to take notes on pancake quality, and Thomas watching them both, still half afraid he would wake up back on a shelter cot. After the dishes were cleared, Julian wiped his hands on a towel, exhaled, and turned to Thomas more seriously. Ready to go to the bank? Thomas felt his stomach drop. I mean, yes. I need to see it. Then let's do it, Julian said. Today's the day you get answers. The drive to the bank carried an aura of quiet tension. Emily, strapped into the back seat, hummed to herself, blissfully oblivious to the storm of anxiety swirling inside her father. Thomas stared out the window, fingers tapping nervously against his jeans. Julian kept glancing at him. You okay? He finally asked. I don't know, Thomas murmured. Part of me still feels like this is some kind of mistake. Like when we get there, they'll say it's all an error and then I'll just go back. Julian's voice was calm but firm. Thomas, listen to me. Whatever's in that account is yours. You saw the reaction yesterday. Nobody fakes shock like that. And even if the universe is playing some ridiculous prank, which I doubt, you won't be going back to the streets. Not if I have anything to say about it. Thomas swallowed hard. Gratitude, fear, and disbelief tangled inside him like a knot he couldn't loosen. By the time they arrived at the bank, his heart was pounding. The glass doors slid open, and the familiar scent of air conditioning and polished floors hit him, not comforting, but cold. A reminder of yesterday's humiliation. A reminder of the laughter he'd endured. Except today, something was different. People behind the counters looked at him with curiosity. Respect, even caution. It made his pulse race even faster. Julian walked beside him like a silent pillar of reassurance. The manager from yesterday, Mr. Langford, spotted him immediately and practically sprinted across the lobby. Mr. Reed, sir, we're ready for you. Please, come this way. Sir. Thomas nearly stumbled at the word. Inside a private office, the manager gestured toward two chairs. Julian and Thomas sat, while Emily climbed onto Thomas's lap, tiny hands gripping his shirt. Mr. Langford cleared his throat. Mr. Reed. After yesterday's system delay, we completed a full verification. Your account is active and the funds are legitimate. Thomas's breath caught. But how? I don't even understand. The manager turned his computer screen toward them. On it glowed a number so surreal, so enormous. Thomas's vision blurred for a moment. 8 digits. Money he couldn't even fathom. Money that didn't make sense. Emily tugged at his sleeve. Daddy, is it good news? Thomas tried to speak, but emotion clawed at his throat. I think so, sweetheart. The manager continued. The deposit was made 2 years ago by an anonymous sender. The memo only said, for Thomas Reed, when life brings him low, let this lift him back up. Julian's eyebrows shot upward. Anonymous? Do you know anyone who'd... No, Thomas whispered. No one. After my wife passed, and the bills started piling up, everyone disappeared. I didn't have anyone left. Mr. Langford clasped his hands. Well, whoever it was, they left you a substantial gift. And, Mr. Reed, there's more. Thomas blinked. More? The manager clicked another tab. The account has been accruing interest, significant interest. What you saw just now isn't the original amount. It has grown. Thomas's heartbeat thundered in his ears. His hands shook. He felt dizzy, like the ground had tilted beneath him. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Julian murmured. Just breathe, man. Mr. Langford closed the file. You can withdraw, invest, transfer, anything you choose. Our financial advisors are ready whenever you are. But Thomas barely heard him. He was drowning in shock, confusion, and gratitude all at once. Emily leaned her head against his chest, her warmth anchoring him. Julian placed a steady hand on Thomas's shoulder. Hey, look at me. Thomas forced himself to meet his eyes. You're not alone anymore, Julian said quietly. Not in this, not in anything. We'll figure this out together. Thomas's breath trembled. Why? Why are you helping me? Julian smiled, just a small, gentle curve of the lips. Because everyone deserves someone who believes in them. And because kindness is supposed to spread. Someone gave you a miracle. Let me help you carry it. Thomas bowed his head, overwhelmed. After the meeting, after the signatures and explanations and confirmations, the three of them stepped out of the bank into bright sunlight. Thomas stopped just outside the doors, staring up at the sky as though trying to understand why fate had chosen today to change his life. Julian watched him carefully. So, what now? Thomas exhaled shakily. I don't know. I've never had choices before. Well, Julian said, nudging him lightly. Good news. You've got a whole lot of them now. Emily took Thomas's hand, swinging it playfully. Daddy, does this mean we can have a home? Thomas felt tears prick his eyes again. Yes, sweetheart, he whispered. I think it does. Julian clapped his hands dramatically. Then step one, let's celebrate. Ice cream? Emily gasped like it was the greatest idea ever conceived. Yes, Thomas laughed, a real laugh, full and unrestrained for the first time in years. As they walked toward the car, something shifted inside him, the weight he'd been carrying for so long, grief, fear, shame, felt just a little lighter, and though he still didn't know who had given him this miracle, he silently promised he would not waste it. He would rebuild not just for himself, but for Emily, and maybe with Julian's unexpected friendship, he could rebuild something even bigger than a life. He could rebuild hope. That night, long after the sun had dipped beneath the skyline and the city lights shimmered like scattered diamonds, Thomas found himself standing on the balcony of Julian's penthouse. The cool breeze brushed against his face as he leaned on the railing, looking out over the city that had once swallowed him whole. Now, for the first time, it felt like the city wasn't pushing him down, but pulling him upward. Yet despite the quiet beauty of the night, his mind churned. Not with fear, exactly, but with an intensity of thought that made him feel anchored to the moment in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Inside the apartment, Emily slept in the guest room Julian had decorated with soft fairy lights and a stuffed unicorn he'd bought her on a whim. Hearing her soft breathing through the cracked door had eased something deep inside Thomas. She wasn't scared. She wasn't cold. She wasn't hungry. And for a struggling father who had fought every day to shield her from the worst of their circumstances, that alone felt like a blessing too big to measure. Julian stepped out onto the balcony, holding 2 mugs of steaming tea. You look like a philosopher debating the universe, he teased as he handed Thomas a mug. Thomas accepted it with a grateful nod. Just thinking. Dangerous, Julian replied with a grin. But when he saw Thomas wasn't in the mood for jokes, his expression softened. What's on your mind? How fast everything changed. Thomas stared into the dark liquid in his mug, watching the steam rise. 2 days ago, I was sleeping on a cot in a shelter. Today, I'm being told I have enough money to build a new life. A real one. It doesn't feel real. Julian leaned against the railing. Does it feel good? Thomas hesitated. Yes. And terrifying. I've never had power. Money gives you choices. And choices mean responsibility. You've handled worse than responsibility. Julian said gently. You survived things most people never could. That account didn't make you strong. You already were. The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. He looked away, suddenly unable to speak around the knot forming in his throat. For years, the world had treated him like he was invisible or worse, like he was a burden. To hear someone say he was strong, it felt like someone had finally seen him. Julian let the silence settle before speaking again. Come with me tomorrow. I want to show you something. Thomas raised a brow. Show me what? A place, Julian said. Vaguely. You'll see. The next morning, Thomas woke up feeling strangely grounded, as though a quiet determination had taken root overnight. After breakfast, another hilarious experience involving Julian burning toast and Emily dramatically declaring herself the breakfast quality inspector. The three of them got into Julian's car. The drive led them out of the shiny downtown district and into a quieter part of the city where buildings weren't skyscrapers, but old structures with stories carved into their weathered walls. They pulled up in front of a large empty lot with a faded sign. Thomas frowned. What is this place? Julian stepped forward. This, he said, gesturing to the open land, is where my parents started their first shelter. Thomas blinked, caught off guard. Your parents ran shelters? Julian nodded. They did. They taught me that money means nothing if you don't use it to lift others. When they passed, the board that took over the charity sold this place and shut down the project. They said it wasn't profitable. He scoffed, as if helping people should ever be measured in profit. Thomas walked slowly across the space, his shoes crunching against gravel. He could almost imagine the echoes of what it used to be. Laughter, footsteps, conversations, hope. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. You brought me here for a reason, he said softly. Julian joined him. I did. Because you remind me of the kind of people my parents always fought for. People who deserved more than what life gave them. People who needed a hand up, not a handout. Thomas swallowed. The air felt heavy. And I want to help you build something here. Thomas turned sharply. Help me build what? A shelter, Julian said simply. A real one, not a warehouse with cots. A place that feels like home. A place where dignity comes first. A place for people like the man you were yesterday, and the man you refused to give up on. The idea slammed into Thomas like a wave, unexpected, heavy, powerful. He felt his heart beat faster. His mind immediately spiraled into reasons to say no. I'm not qualified, he whispered. I don't know anything about running something like this. That's not true, Julian countered. You know exactly what people need because you lived it. You survived it. No director, no board member, no donor knows what you know. Thomas shook his head. I don't want to fail. Then don't. It's not that easy. No, Julian agreed. It's not. But nothing in your life has ever been easy, and you still made it here, didn't you? You're already proof that impossible things can happen. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He looked at the empty land again, imagining rooms, kitchens, quiet corners, warm beds, all filled with people who just needed one chance the way he did. Emily tugged on his pant leg. Daddy, can we make rooms for kids too? Her innocence, her hope, broke something open in him. Yes, Thomas whispered, voice trembling. Yes, sweetheart. We could. Julian smiled, proud and almost relieved. Then let's do it together. Over the next few days, Thomas's world filled with meetings, planning sessions, and introductions to architects and advisors who treated him with respect simply because Julian insisted he belonged at the table. But beyond that, Thomas began to believe he belonged too. Every question he asked was taken seriously. Every idea he voiced was considered thoughtfully, and slowly his confidence grew. But one question lingered like a shadow. Who put the money in his account? Every night he asked himself the same thing. Someone had saved him. Someone had believed he deserved a future, and Thomas couldn't rest until he knew who. One afternoon, while Emily drew pictures on the coffee table and Julian typed away on his laptop, Thomas sat quietly staring at the memo line of the deposit Mr. Langford had shown him. For Thomas Reed, when life brings him low, let this lift him back up. The phrasing felt familiar, too. Familiar. His heart stuttered. He jumped up from the couch, startling both Julian and Emily. "Thomas? What's wrong?" Julian asked. Thomas didn't answer at first. He rushed to the small box he kept in the guest room, his box of memories, his box of grief. He opened it with shaking hands and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was an old letter from his late wife, written years before she got sick. He unfolded it, scanning the curved handwriting he knew by heart. "I know life will be hard sometimes," the letter read, "but even when things fall apart, I want something to lift you back up. Something to remind you that you're not alone." Thomas's knees nearly gave out. Julian stepped forward. "Thomas, what is it?" Tears filled his eyes. I think she planned this." "Your wife?" Thomas nodded, voice breaking. "She always worried about what would happen to Emily and me if things got bad. She must have saved something, set something up, and I never knew." A raw sob escaped him. Grief, love, relief, all bleeding together. Julian placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thomas, she loved you. This is her way of taking care of you even now." Thomas clutched the letter against his chest. "I thought I failed her. I thought losing everything meant I'd lost her too." "You didn't fail," Julian said softly. "She believed in you more than you ever believed in yourself. And now, you get to honor her, build something she would be proud of." Thomas wiped his eyes, breathing shakily. He looked at Emily, who watched him with innocent curiosity. "Daddy, are you okay?" He knelt and pulled her into his arms. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm okay. Mommy helped us. She helped us even now." Emily smiled softly. "She's an angel." Thomas nodded, tears falling freely now. "Yes, she is." And in that moment Thomas felt something inside him settle, a gentle peace that wrapped around him like a warm blanket. His wife hadn't left them with nothing. She'd left them with hope. And now it was his turn to give. That hope to others, a crack in certainty, a hiccup in his superiority, a whisper of dread telling him that the world he thought he understood was about to reveal a truth he had never anticipated. And high above that slowly unraveling truth sat the memory of his own cruel laugh, sharp, arrogant, echoing in a bank that was about to fall silent in the most humiliating way imaginable. The next few weeks moved with a kind of momentum Thomas never could have imagined. What once felt like a life teetering on the edge of collapse now surged forward with purpose and direction. Every morning began with Emily climbing into his bed, her tiny arms wrapping around him as if claiming the new life they were stepping into. Every day meant meetings, plans, site visits, and discussions that no one would have ever imagined someone like him, someone who had slept on cold concrete, would lead. And every evening ended with a sense of growing belonging, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was becoming something new. But it wasn't instant transformation. Change came with sweat, fear, and moments of self-doubt that stabbed at him like echoes from his past. The world may have opened its gates for him, but walking through them meant he had to confront who he had become while life had taken everything from him. One morning, as he stood staring at architectural sketches for the shelter, his shelter, Thomas felt a tremor of panic ripple through him. "What if I'm not ready?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Julian, who stood beside him with a stack of notes, looked carefully at him. "You're thinking again." Thomas forced a small laugh. "Yeah. Bad habit. Want to talk about it?" Thomas hesitated, then exhaled. "I'm scared, Julian. I'm not a leader. I'm not educated. I don't have fancy degrees or business skills or anything people expect in someone who runs a project like this." Julian set the papers down and leaned against the table. "Do you want the truth?" Thomas nodded. "You're right," Julian said simply. "You don't have those things. But you have something better. You have empathy. You have experience no one can teach. You have lived the pain this place is meant to heal. You know what it feels like to be unseen. People don't need a businessman running this. They need someone who understands them. Thomas swallowed hard. But what if I fail? Julian shrugged gently. Then you'll learn, and you'll keep going. That's what leadership really is. Thomas looked back at the sketches, rooms for families, a library area, workshops, counseling offices, a dining hall filled with warmth, not silence. A courtyard with trees, flowers, and benches, a place where broken souls could breathe again. His wife had given him a miracle. Now he had to honor it. Construction began faster than Thomas expected. Seeing the first foundation stones laid felt surreal. He'd brought Emily to the site one afternoon, and she'd run across the open space with her arms stretched wide. "It's so big," she squealed. "Daddy, can my room in the shelter have lots of stars on the walls, for the kids who like stars?" Thomas laughed, kneeling down to meet her eyes. "Sweetheart, the shelter isn't for us to live in. I know," she said, "but I want the kids who come here to feel warm, like how I feel now." Thomas ruffled her hair, filled with quiet awe. His daughter, even after everything they'd been through, radiated nothing but kindness. She hadn't been hardened by the world. She had been softened into something bright. He wished his wife could see her now. As weeks turned into months, the building rose from the ground, a physical embodiment of resilience, hope, and something almost sacred. The city began to talk. Reporters came. Investors called. Volunteers reached out. People who had never noticed Thomas before suddenly admired him. But he didn't let it change him. At night he still sat with Emily, reading stories. He still kept his wife's letter in the small box by his bed, and he still carried the memory of every cold night he'd spent trying to keep his daughter warm. And then came opening day, the morning of the ceremony. Thomas found himself staring into the mirror longer than usual. He was wearing a simple suit, borrowed from Julian, tailored last minute, but even so, he didn't quite recognize the man looking back. Not because of the clothes, but because of the strength he now saw in his own reflection. Emily stood beside him wearing a small dress with yellow flowers. "Daddy?" she asked, tugging on his sleeve. "Are you nervous?" He smiled, a little. She held up her hand. "Hold mine. Then you'll be brave." He took her hand, letting her warmth steady him. "Thank you, sweetheart." Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Reporters, city officials, neighbors, volunteers, and people from the shelters he used to stay in. When Thomas stepped onto the small stage, they erupted into applause. He froze for a moment, overwhelmed. Julian nudged him subtly. "Go on." Thomas stepped forward, cleared his throat, and let the silence settle before he began speaking. "This shelter," he started slowly, "this place is not a building. It's a promise. A promise that no one in this city should feel invisible again." His voice wavered, but he continued. "I used to walk these streets with my daughter, trying to pretend I wasn't scared. I used to stand in lines for food, hoping it wouldn't run out before our turn. I used to sleep in shelters that were so overcrowded people slept sitting up. I know what it means to hit rock bottom, and I know what it means when someone reaches out a hand." He paused, eyes scanning the crowd. Many were crying. This shelter exists because someone believed people like me deserve a second chance. My wife, his voice cracked, left me a gift I didn't understand at first. But now I do. She wanted Emily and me to rise, and she wanted everyone who struggles to rise too. Julian stood off to the side, watching with unmistakable pride. "This place will offer beds, food, and safety," Thomas continued. "But it will also offer dignity, classes, jobs, hope. Because people don't just need shelter, they need a future." He took Emily's hand, raising it gently. "She is my reason. And now this place is my purpose." The applause was thunderous. Julian stepped up next to him and whispered with a grin, "You're officially a better speaker than I am." Thomas laughed through the emotion swelling in his chest. After the ribbon was cut, people streamed inside, touching the walls, walking the halls, admiring the spaces that had once been nothing but a dream in Thomas's mind. The whole building felt warm. Soft lights, natural colors, wide windows that let in sunshine. It didn't feel like a shelter. It felt like home. Later, when the crowd had thinned, Thomas walked into the courtyard alone. He sat on one of the benches and looked up at the sky. A single patch of sunlight filtered through the leaves above him, landing warm against his face. "Thank you," he whispered. To his wife, to fate, to the stranger who deposited the money, to Julian, to the world for finally letting him breathe. Footsteps sounded behind him. Julian sat beside him without a word. "Busy day," Julian said. Thomas chuckled. "You could say that. Any regrets?" "None," Thomas answered instantly. "Not anymore." Julian stretched his legs out, exhaling. "You know, Thomas, whatever your future becomes, whether you stay here running this place or go on to do something even bigger, I hope you know something." "What's that?" "You're not the homeless dad people ignored anymore. You're not the man asking for his account balance. You're the man who changed lives because someone once changed yours." Thomas stared ahead, letting that truth sink deep into his chest. "Thank you," he murmured. "No," Julian said, smiling softly. "Thank you. You've reminded me what kindness really looks like." Emily came running into the courtyard then, breathless and glowing. "Daddy, Daddy, they love it. Everyone says it feels like magic." Thomas scooped her into his arms, his heart swelling. "It is magic, sweetheart. You helped make it." She beamed, wrapping her arms around his neck. Mommy would be proud. He held her close, voice thick. Yes, she would. And as the sun began to set, casting golden light across the shelter, built from sorrow, love, loss, hope, and a miracle, Thomas finally felt whole. His past no longer defined him. His pain no longer controlled him. His story no longer ended in struggle. It ended in kindness, in healing, in purpose, and in a legacy that would lift countless others the way someone once lifted him. The truth had shined, and it changed everything.